Okay, so I said that I wanted to talk about an alternative conception of risk, and I'm just going to sketch that here. This is what you might call a phenomenological approach to risk. So this is the idea that we all have a lived sense of what risk means. That risk is a kind of constitutive feature of human life because we're finite, we're vulnerable, and we exist in time, and we deal with uncertainty. So risk is just this intrinsic feature of being a vulnerable, mortal creature who's living towards an uncertain future. And so, should you go get a degree? Should you take the job that you're offered when you graduate? Should you get married? Should you have children at some point? These are all decisions, major life decisions that involve risk, and we have a sense that they're risky when we engage in them. We don't know how they're going to turn out. So whether or not that should be construed in probabilistic terms, you might argue, is an open question, because before anyone invented probability, right, probability theory didn't emerge until around the 16th century. Before that area of mathematics emerged in the context of gambling, people made these sorts of decisions and they experienced the risk. So one way of thinking about a phenomenological notion of risk is to say, what human experience does the objective definition of risk try to capture, right? So this is a way of thinking about science in general. Science in general tries to idealize or to abstract away from concrete experience to come up with a more formal model for understanding things, often something that you can put into mathematical models so you can make predictions and that sort of thing. So what is the mathematical formal definition of risk as expectation value trying to capture in human terms, right? So we have the probability multiplied by the cost of an unwanted event. Probability tells us about the significance of the chance of something happening. Cost tells us about the severity of the harm that might occur. So the event is unwanted because it involves harm, some kind of loss or injury. Cost tells us about how severe that is, and probability tells us about how significant the chance is. But all of those notions have meaning outside of a mathematical context. Those are fundamentally human notions that existed prior to the advent of probability theory in the 16th century. So let's think about them in kind of humanistic or phenomenological terms, right? What is harm? Well, one famous, really seminal definition of harm comes from Joel Feinberg's work, Harm to Others, which has been a very influential piece of work at the intersection of moral and legal philosophy. In that book, Feinberg defines harm as the thwarting, setting back, or defeating of an interest. And he says that we have an interest in something if I have a kind of stake in its well-being or success. So all my interests are defined by those things that I have a stake in. And I have a stake in something's well-being or success when I stand to gain or lose, depending on its issue or its condition. So I have a stake in something if my own well-being in any way hangs on its well-being, right? So harm, on this way of understanding things, it's not something that's just out there, objectively speaking. It can't be, because it's fundamentally defined in terms of my interests and stakes. So there's an intrinsic relational aspect of harm. Harm isn't something that's just out there. It's something that's intrinsically related to my own well-being, my sense of self, my interests, and what's at stake for me. So risks are risks on this approach because they connect with our interests. So there's no such thing as a purely objective risk. There are only risks that exist in relation to agents and the interests that they happen to have. Just to give you some more of the language that Feinberg used to talk about these things, right? He defines interests as those things in which one has a stake. And these interests, or perhaps more accurately, the things these interests are in, are distinguishable components of a person's well-being. He flourishes or languishes as they flourish or languish. So again, you have this intrinsically relational notion, right? So something can be harm to me only in relation to the interest that I happen to have. So we could develop a phenomenological conception of risk based on Feinberg's definition of harm, right? So we could understand risk as an action or event wherein a person faces a significant chance of harm, where harm is understood as a setback to that person's interests. So importantly here, risk has an intrinsically futural character. Risk doesn't exist in the present. It's something that exists only in the future. as something that could go wrong, right? So once a risk arrives, it's no longer a risk. It's some concrete harm. It's an injury or a loss. So my experience of risk is only possible in virtue of certain temporal abilities that I have that allow me to orient myself in time. The ability to make sense of an event in terms of a wider temporal context, right? So when I deliberate about what sort of future I want, what sort of decisions I want to make to shape my future, I'm opening myself up to this wider temporal context. And it's only when I do that that risks to my interests show up and become salient for me. So risk from a phenomenological point of view is something that emerges when you're in this sort of deliberative planning mode, when you're thinking about what you're going to do in the future. And it's when you're engaged in this kind of skillful deliberation that you register threats to your future self, and then you imaginatively model different possible future states of the world in which you evade that threat, or when you succumb to it and suffer it, suffer the harm that you want to avoid. So this is again, totally non-mathematical, just intuitive, first-personal way to think about how we experience risk. And it doesn't require that we know any objective probabilities. It's a more kind of thinking about deliberation as imagining what might happen and how I could prevent the negative things from happening. So in this phenomenological conception of risk, risk is understood as a significant chance of a future setback to one's interests. So it's important to put the word future in there, because without this temporal dimension to our being, risk wouldn't be something that we ever thought about. But what about significance? So if we're not going to treat significance in these mathematical probabilistic terms, how are we going to think about it? And I suggest that one way to think about it is pragmatically, right? This is sometimes referred to as a pragmatic approach to significance. So pragmatism or pragmatic means pertaining to practical rather than theoretical considerations. So on this approach, whether I should put considerations about risk to work will depend on my current normative practical context, which includes, but is not exhausted by, my interests at stake in my decision, the normative commitments associated with those interests, and the way those interests and commitments stand in relation to the world. And it will depend on my projected future normative practical context as I imagine it based on my current knowledge. Okay, so say I'm a free climber and I'm climbing the wall like this gentleman here is in this picture. Whether or not I experience that activity as a risk will depend fundamentally on who I am, on what my interests are, and on all my sort of normative commitments. So on this phenomenological approach to risk, you have to think about whether or not something constitutes a risk by really getting an internal perspective on that person's entire life, basically, the sum total of things that they care about. And so on a phenomenological approach to risk, questions about risk become this really deep, deliberative question about who this person is and who they want to be in the future. So it's also important to note that on a phenomenological approach, we won't assume that risk is intrinsically bad. The way we formulated the notion of risk and when we're talking about expected value kind of ignored the positive side of risk, pointed that out, that when we take risks, we typically do so because we see a significant chance to advance our interests, whether that's an interest in pleasure or an interest in growth in some sense. And so this is something that shows up in the economics of risk, right? So this here is the positive side of risk in that calculation that we did earlier, the chance that I'll get 50 pounds. But it's important to think that from a phenomenological point of view, when we decide whether or not we're going to do something risky, we're usually thinking about the positive benefits that will come to us if things go our way. And we're not just entirely focused on the potential negative outcomes. There are negative risks, right? There are situations where it seems like only bad things can happen to us, and we have to think about which is the sort of less bad thing and shoot for that one. But there are also a lot of ambiguous risks where it can be a positive outcome or a negative outcome for it. And usually, if you're taking a risk, it's of this ambiguous kind. Now, here's a gentleman walking to work who faced a risk that he never anticipated coming his way. And I just want to point out, like when I'm talking about the phenomenological notion of risk, I'm talking about those risks that you have time to detect so that you can think about them and kind of make a decision about how you're going to deal with it. I think that's the sort of fundamental phenomenological notion of risk. But there are, of course, just random risks that we face just because, again, we're mortal and frail and we can be crushed by things like buses. This guy's safe, by the way, nothing hits him. So I'm not showing you an actual accident. Well, it's an accident, but it's not one where anyone gets hurt. But I just wanted to point that out, right? The phenomenological notion of risk doesn't say that there's no such thing as, risks that just happen to you, even though you don't see them coming. But the main focus of a phenomenological approach to risk will be these deliberative ones, where people have a chance to make decisions about what they're going to do in the face of an uncertain future. Okay, that's all for the phenomenological notion of risk.